Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our course preview for this week's Genesis Scottish Open. Gonna break down what to expect from the Renaissance Club, including a look at some course details, a hole-by-hole breakdown, as well as some of the key stats and metrics that I'm using to identify some of my top plays of the week. The goal with these is to keep it as concise as humanly possible while giving you all the information. So let's go ahead, not dilly-dally, and just hop right on in. We've got no greenskeeper sheet for this week, so just going to start off with our look at the bet the number stuff. So first off, this golf course is in North Berwick, Scotland, so a much different look than what we have in the States, but it's not truly a true link style design. A lot of times over here, especially for Open Championships, we see those pot bunkers and a very similar style of golf course. This track with the Renaissance Club is more of a blend between that style of golf that we'll see for next week at the Open and an American style of golf that is more so about the woodland style, longer course, not as hilly as what you get at a link style golf course. So while some holes will be on the coastline this week, will have that rolling topography to it, you're going to have some inland holes as well that give you a little bit of a different taste. So we'll go through those when we go hole by hole. I'll give you a taste of where some of those differences might be, but it's the perfect kind of test to have the week before the Open Championship. You can get some of these PGA Tour players acclimated to the conditions over here in Scotland, and at the same time, not make it just a 180 difference, right? Not go 0 to 100 from US style golf out there to links. This gives you a good little transition week to go out there and kind of ramp up your game. So there's much more creativity involved when playing a link style of golf, and it's a lot about the low ball hitters as opposed to the guys that are hitting it sky high in the United States. But let's just go through some of the metrics here. So it's a par 70. Members play it as a par 71. So hole number 7 is converted from a par 5 to a par 4 out here for the Tour Pros. But it's a weird par 70. So you've got 3 par 5s, even with the one that's converted. Members play it as 4 par 5s. And then you have 5 par 3s. So again, a weird setup. So though it's only just over 7,200 yards, it plays a whole lot longer than that. You've got the 5 par 3s, which add a little bit of sneaky distance out there, as well as 2 potentially drivable par 4s. Outside of those shorter holes, you've got a lot of longer par 4s. You've got some lengthy iron shots that are required around here, which is where this place can get a lot of its teeth. If we take a look at some of the winning scores at this event, it widely varies based on the weather that we get. So last year we had Rory win at -15. Year before that, Xander won at just -7. But we've had years where it's been Aaron Rai winning in a very extremely difficult year, and then Bernd Wiesberger, who won at this golf course at -22 on the DP World Tour. So depending on the kind of wind conditions that we get, these averages that we're about to go through can vary quite wildly. So while we're going to just take a look at the last 2 years, while this was a PGA Tour and a DP World Tour sanctioned event, and you can see that almost every average on here is going to be slightly harder than what you have on the PGA Tour. So your fairway is pretty narrow over there in Europe. So you'd expect that to be lower than the PGA Tour average, and in fact, it's about 8, nearly 9% lower than what we're used to seeing week to week. Your green average, despite having some massive greens on property here, worth noting that at this golf course, nearly 8,000 square foot greens, they are a fescue grass as well. It's pretty much fescue from tip to toe out there. So that's it from the agronomy angle. Despite having some of the larger surfaces that we have on the entire schedule, over the last 2 seasons, they've actually been hit at a lower rate than what we have on the PGA Tour. So just a 62.3% rate. A lot of because of how firm these greens can play. You're scrambling harder than your tour average, nearly about 1.2% harder. You have slightly more 3-putts here, only about 2.99 birdies per round. Your bogeys per round are higher than your PGA Tour average. So despite this golf course not being overly long, not being, not having 4 or 5 inch rough like you get at some of these major championships, it defends itself out there with its architecture, with its design. It's brilliantly designed. You've got those firm greens, a lot of undulation on them, as I was mentioning before, and it's a true link style setup from that end of the spectrum. Now let's talk about some of the ball striking stuff. So heading into this week, it's going to be a little bit different in 2024. So we talk about the firmness. I mentioned some of these averages. I think we're going to get a very, very easy year. If there's not any wind in the forecast, they're getting rain Monday. They already got that here on Monday. Tuesday, Wednesday, they're expecting even more showers to come through North Berwick. So this golf course, which can play firm and fast, like you see with some of the averages, that's not going to be the case this year, right? Unless you get to the weekend and there's been no rain there and Thursday, Friday, this golf course is going to be extremely soft. And if we get that coupled with next to no wind, that minus 20, minus 22 under par like we had with Wiesberger might even be in play here for 2024. So it's worth noting that I want to go over these baseline averages, give you an idea of what we've seen the last 2 years, but there's a good chance because of the weather forecast that we have that's going to play, I think, a little bit easier than what we had back there. So if we take a look at some of the shots gained metrics for your top scorers, you'll see that there's quite a few that weren't gaining a bunch off the tee. So guys like Lingenberth last year, he top 5 to was losing off the tee. Guys like a Tom Kim losing about 0.6 strokes per round. JT Poston top 10, and that was despite losing over a stroke off the tee per round. But what you see is a ton of dark green with the approach play, a ton of dark green over here with the shots gained putting. And if we go to the year before that, we don't have the shots gained metrics to work with, but just looking at the leaderboard, we see a lot of those ball strikers towards the top. I mean, Xander, Kurt Kitayama, we've seen him show up at other real difficult ball striking tests. Tom Kim is top 10 to both years. Tommy Fleetwood, same thing, top 5 finish out there both years, or top 10 for sure, out there for Tommy Fleetwood. You see a lot of these DP World Tour standouts, right? Guys that before they came over to the PGA Tour were the best players over on that side of the pond. Those would be guys like a Fleetwood, your Matt Fitzpatrick's, for example. Tom Kim's also been really good at Open Championships, so not a surprise that the Scottish Open has been a very successful event for him as well. It's a little bit of a different kind of test. And I do think with the rain that it might play slightly longer. It might be slightly more guys that are popping out there with the off the tee play, but this is always a second shot golf course. It's always a demanding golf course when it comes to those long irons. And as for any event out there, whether it's PGA Tour, DP World Tour, you're going to have to fill it up with the flat stick to go out there and get up there to the top 5, top 10 as well. So it's not that atypical or that different from what we're used to seeing over here on this side of the pond, but definitely a bit of a European influence, right? You can see that in the leaderboards over the last few years. I mean, McIntyre was still on the DP World Tour, but he finished in second here last year. We had guys like Terrell Hatton, Fleetwood, who again, right, like we mentioned before, were guys that are used to getting it done on these European link style setups. Højgaard, same thing, right? He was still on the DP World Tour at that stage. So not a surprise, in my opinion, that you saw them showing up at this kind of golf course. Now we're going to quickly go hole by hole for you guys and give you an idea of what these players are going to face. So hole number 1 is a 460-yard par 4, and it gives you a pretty good sense for what this golf course is about. When you miss far offline, unless you're missing like 40, 50 yards offline, it's pretty much all that same 3-4 inch rough. So it's penal. It's not like it's non-existent out there, but the real trouble out here where you're going to go out there and take penalty shots is when you're missing like 40, 50 yards offline. You miss to the left in some of that deep hay, could be a little bit of trouble, and same thing off there to the right side with those trees. Around the green, you get the sense for the quote-unquote link style setup that we have here. I'd say that off the tee, it's a pretty similar setup to what we get in America, but when we get on and around the greens at the Renaissance Club is where you see that a lot of that European impact. Next up, we got a 485-yard par 4, so definitely a longer hole, but, just like hole number 1, there's not a lot to trick you up. I mean, even off the tee, you've got this one fairway bunker to worry about, and then up here near the green, a massive green complex, which is mostly protected by the humps and hollows that you have around the green. Hole 3 is your first par 5. It is about 600 yards, and this is truly one of the more American holes that we have out here. It's that long par 5. You've got these trees down the right, which you could choose to take it over if you're somebody like a Rory or a high ball hitter that has the firepower to get over those, and reachable in 2 for your power players. So unlike some of the shorter, more positional, strategic holes that we get around a Renaissance Club, hole 3 is one that the Americans can kind of overpower. Hole 4 is the shorter par 4, one that you can get near the surface if you choose to take driver and take a slightly more aggressive line off the tee, but still a shorter hole that, depending on pin location, should be a pretty solid birdie look. Hole 5 is 337. This is for sure a drivable par 4, depending on wind direction. If it is into the wind, this little bit of a wall, it's an old prehistoric wall that they have out here on the golf course, does come into play. So if it's playing into the wind, you might see people a little bit shy of going out there and just banging a driver just because of that out there on each side, but is drivable if it's a neutral wind direction and especially if it's playing downwind. Hole 6 is 145 yards, so shorter par 3, but you can't fall asleep on it. A lot of undulation that you can't really get perspective on from some of the overhead views. Hole 7 is that converted par 5, so they will be playing it from one tee box up. So just to go ahead and I guess account for that, we're going to move it up here to the next tee position, and you'll see that it's playing about 500 yards from there. So still a beefy par 4, but not nearly the birdie luck you'd hope for. Is that what you're going to get out there for the members at least? Hole 8 is 446, so mid-length par 4. It kind of forces you to lay up off the tee because of these fairway bunkers. If you choose to take driver, you're going to take on quite a bit of risk, especially with this last one out there. And as such, you're probably going to be left with a mid to long iron in, especially if you're laying up. Hole 9 is 217, so a longer par 3. This one does tend to play into the prevailing wind, and when it is the prevailing wind, can be one of the more difficult holes that we have on site. Hole 10, so if you're starting on the backside, you do start on a first off a par 5, but this is links land over here. So front 9 was more so inland, a lot of those quote-unquote American holes, like I was pointing out there, but the back 9, you get a lot of holes here that are along the coast. Prime example would be hole number 10 here. Now, we're not the whole way down near the coast yet, but you can see we're getting closer to it. And this land is a lot more hilly. You've got a bunch of little, hills to the right, little hookups, or I don't even know what you want to call them. They've got a bunch of words for them over there on the UK side, but it's what you're used to seeing out there at an Open Championship. Your long bombers are going to hit it over here towards this long, little, massive hill to the right, and could get home in 2 here. I know it's about 600 yards, but it does play slightly downhill, plays pretty firm usually this time of year. Days 1 and 2 is going to be a little bit harder to reach with that rain, but definitely still birdie look for all players. 11 is 506 yards, another one of the holes that's a little bit more hilly because of its positioning on this property, and definitely tricky because of the length, but unless you're missing in this natural area to the left, it's not really nothing here's rocket science. I mean, scoring average last year was under par. That should tell you a lot right there. Hole 12 is 202 yards. This is playing into what can be a nasty wind. Anytime the wind is coming off the water here, it tends to play pretty nasty because you're playing directly into it out here in this par 3. But a lot of times it's playing downwind, so you're not worrying about that with hole 12. Just like you had with the rock wall in the front 9, that drivable par 4 8th, you do have that rock wall to the right, which can be troublesome. You've actually seen people miss it out there on the green complex to the right and have to chip over to get back to that green complex. 13 is maybe the most iconic hole that you have on property here. If this plays downwind, it's actually drivable. So if you take the direct line to the green, you'd have to carry it about 340 to get close, but because it plays downhill and potentially downwind, last year you saw a few people try and poke it out there towards the surface, and it would become even more drivable if they decide to move up that tee box. But either way, it's very picturesque. You've got that great landscape to the left and a birdie hole regardless of the wind direction. 14 is 161 yards, so this is a shorter par 3, and you do have that rock wall towards the backside, which really isn't in play unless they're using that back right pin or even that front right pin that you have over there to the right, and when you use those pins, it can become a little bit dicey for sure. 15 is 484, so longer par 4. It's pretty wide open off the tee, though, so as long as you're not missing in one of those little pot bunkers, you're probably okay in 15. 16 is 572, so this is a par 5. It is reachable in 2 for pretty much everyone on tour. So a birdie look before some tough finishing holes. First of which will be a 200-yard par 3, which this green complex isn't that tricky. It's actually one of the more flat on property, but it is a long iron shot, which is where a lot of the difficulty comes in. And then 18 is, in my opinion, the most difficult hole that you have out here, and it's because it plays uphill for your second shot. So your tee shot, pretty narrow. I'd say kind of on par for the rest of the golf course though, but the second shot plays uphill, and when this plays into the wind, the prevailing wind, like I said before, is coming into here, just like it is over here on this drivable par 4, like I was mentioning before. If it's playing into the wind like it typically does, and it's playing uphill, it's why that shot that Rory hit, that was a 200-yard 2-iron, to go out there and ice the golf tournament, was such a good shot, right? It's why the announcers, everyone watching was just in awe that he was able to pull that off, because it's one of the more difficult shots that you have have on tour. This green has a massive false front, which can lead to a really difficult up and down. And again, just like every other green here, you can't really get a true perspective for how difficult the shots are because you can't see all the hills and, you know, little bumps that you have on the green complexes. All right, now that we've seen the golf course, let's go through some of our key stats for the week and what I'm using to try and identify my top plays. So first and foremost, for a golf course like this, you want to look at your regular old shots gained approach. So on here on Bet the Number, of course, they have these kind of stats, but what I love is that they went into a little bit more detail. So we can look at our shots gained approach over last 24, last 36 rounds, whatever, you know, sort of sample size you want to use. But this 120 to 180 range is where you're really going to make your hay this week. As I mentioned before, that's the range of the golf course where a majority of your iron shots are going to come from. A majority of those par 4s, even some of the par 3s, you'll be hitting shots from there. And if you're laying up on the par 5s, you're likely going to have a mid to long iron in hand. So rather than looking at the shots from sub 120, which you're hardly going to have around this kind of golf course, or really focusing on the super long iron shots, which are really only going to hit like maybe 3-4 times out there and around, I love that they're looking at that mid iron to long iron range where most of your shots are going to come from. So if we take a look at that proximity bucket in particular, you can see some of the top poppers for this week. So just to give you a few guys that I think stand out to me, Matt Wallace up there, also a player very used to these European type of conditions. So maybe somebody to keep an eye on there. We've got Eric Van Rooyen also showing up there too. Benny Ann, who also played well here last year, a player that's the top 5 in that category. Alexander Bjork has not quite had the PGA Tour start that he was hoping for. Of course, has status out here and did not make a whole lot of it. So has not been playing that much recently out here on the PGA Tour, but maybe getting him back on his home soil over here, getting him back to the DP World Tour side can get him a good finish because these mid irons have been excellent for Alexander Bjork. You can throw Aaron Ryan to that, also Mackenzie Hughes, Corey Connors, guys that are popping with those mid irons. If you're just looking at regular old shots gained approach, I think that's also very viable this week. Guys that were showing up here that maybe weren't showing up as high out there in those mid irons were guys like a Xander Schauffele, a Doug Gim, Sepp Straka, all players that are excelling with the irons. The one thing I'll say is, I guess with Sepp, maybe a lot of that's the shorter irons where you've seen him succeeding. So maybe he's the one guy to kind of throw out of that list. Other guys on here like Aaron Rye, Ludwig Aberg, for example, we know they can stripe those long irons. I'm not so worried about it with them. Other guys to keep an eye on would be Keith Mitchell, Tom Hoagie, gaining about 3/4 of a stroke per round with their irons. It looks like Victor Hovland is back out there with his iron play, and you know, when he's firing on all cylinders, he's always worth consideration, pretty much regardless of the golf course. It's worth noting that Victor, just like some of the other Europeans, plays on the DP World Tour quite often and has found some success when he's gone over there and played on the other side of the pond. So, you know, while he hasn't had the best history here, right, cut than a top 25 finish there last year, a player that I would probably keep an eye on for a potential first timer going off here, right? He hasn't had that top 10 finish yet, but I definitely think he's live for it here in 2024. Another stat category I want to look at is they've got the putting over 25 feet on here, which makes a lot of sense given how large the green complexes are. If we're looking at the shots gained over here with these putts, it's not only going to tell us, right, how many of them they're making, right, giving us an idea of the chances of a guy going out there and making some bomb putts, but also that 3-putt avoidance. So if we're taking a look at this category, a few guys to point out: McIntyre, who's played extremely well here in Open Championships, shows up there. Sami Valimaki is coming in with pretty solid form himself, right? 10 shots gained last week at the John Deere. Another guy that's pretty good at not 3-putting. You got guys like Mark Hubbard, Grazerman that are pretty good long putters. In terms of guys that kind of just fit this golf course, Thomas Dietrich stands out like a sore thumb. Really good putter on these fescue greens, a guy with a ton of experience, having been a player on the DP World Tour in the past. And you can see that his shots gained metrics, the ball striking, haven't been amazing lately, but he's still top 4 out there at the PGA Championship. He still finished top 15 at the US Open. So, you know, the stats might not be the best, but he's got 2 top 15 finishes at the best fields that you're going to get in golf this year. So you're telling me he's capable of that? We're getting him in a slightly weaker field here at a golf course that, you know, he's popping out there with the putting, you know, whether it's the fescue stuff or looking at the long-term putting, the long putting. I love that out there for Thomas Dietrich. You've got Griffin showing up there after having that electric finish at the John Deere. Maybe a little bit of an eye, somebody to keep an eye on. You've got Christian Bezuidenhout, another guy who's played a ton of golf on the DP World Tour, and he's having his best year ever out here on the PGA Tour. Now, lately, it's fallen off just a little bit, right? He hasn't had a lot of those top finishes. Memorial top 5 was probably the best that we got from him, but he was everyone's darling just a few weeks ago. I mean, 2-3 weeks ago, literally everyone was playing Seabez. Now we're getting him on this side of the pond, which I think is very helpful for him as he has experience playing out here in the DP World Tour, and he fits a lot of the metrics that we're looking at. You can look at Sunjay, another guy who's good with the long putting. Davis Thompson, guys like Aaron Rai also showing up there. And I also want to look at putting. So they've got just your regular putting stats on here. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot on fescue. So if you're trying to find like the agronomy of the week, right? Bent grass, we look at a lot on the PGA Tour. Same thing with Bermuda grass. We don't have a lot of those metrics to work with. So my putting this week is just going to be regular old shots gained putting with the added little bonus of shots gained putting on slow greens. So just looking at shots gained putting on Bet the Number, that's what they have in their model here over the last, the last 36 rounds is what they're working with. You can see some of the top putters in the field. And while I don't think this is a putting first sort of event, you are going to have to make some putts to top 5 and win, right? That's just the reality of regardless what tour you're playing on. So to completely ignore that aspect of the game, especially one that is needed on literally every single hole, would be a massive mistake in my opinion. So I guess just a few guys that are popping here that maybe were showing up in a few other categories. Well, Xander Schauffele, we know his ball striking has been there, but he's also been the 3rd best putter in the world. Thomas Dietrich, the 4th best putter in the world. Maybe not the best shots gained metrics, but he's not horrible at any of the 3 tee to green categories, right? Like we've got dark red up there with Denny off the tee. We've got some red with Hughes off the tee and on approach. Dietrich's a lot more respectable in all 3 categories, so I think maybe a little bit notable there. McIntyre, right? Obviously, top finish here at this event last year, coming into this event this year with much better form than what we had last year. And he's playing on the PGA Tour, which is a huge step up in talent level. So definitely a guy to keep an eye on this week. A few other guys that are, popping in a few other categories. There's Bezuidenhout, who we were mentioning before. There's Sam Stevens, who's been really playing a lot of solid golf lately, right? A couple top 15s. T35 at the John Deere is far from a bad performance for him. We got Rory way down here, who, of course, won this event last year. No idea what I'm going to do with this guy. Just a head case, right? I mean, the story writes itself at this stage out there with Rory. So I guess that'll depend on his ownership out there in DFS. If he's low owned, I'll probably play some Rory, but I've got a sneaking suspicion that with the shots gained metrics, I mean, these finishes, right? 2nd, 15th, 4th, 12th, 1st, that people are still going to play the guy. So does fit the golf course quite well, though, obviously, right? He's the Bet the Numbers #1 model ranking this week. He won the event last year. Whether it's approach stats, I mean, everything's green here except for some of that lag putting, which a little bit surprising, I would say, especially because Rory makes a lot of those 25-plus footers, but I wouldn't worry about that all that much, right? Everything else being green more than makes up for that. A few other guys I want to point out here. Ben Griffin, right? He's been really good on approach. Another one of those guys that was showing up from the putting category. Outside of that, guys, there's not that much I'm looking at this week, right? This is a golf course that's a lot different than what we have on the PGA Tour, so you don't want to get too bogged down in the stats in your modeling for this event, because frankly, normally we talk about comp courses and whatnot. There's not really any to talk about this week. This is so close to what we have at the Open Championship that really for comps, I'd say this golf course, right, past iterations of it, and then maybe Open Championship setups, right? And then outside of that, I don't think there's that much that we can compare to, especially over there in the United States. So with this kind of field, the fact that this is now a DP World Tour and PGA Tour sanctioned event just makes it a little bit difficult to go out there and trust your modeling, because these PGA Tour players, the stats are coming from courses that aren't very that comparable. And then you've got all these DP World Tour guys that, their shots gained metrics, their results are coming from completely different events in lower tier events when it comes to the talent level. So in my opinion this week, right, it's important to know the golf course, important to know, what kind of stats are going to make a player pop, but don't bog yourself down in it too much where you're completely screwing yourself. That's what I'll say, right? You can use it as a little bit of a helpful aid this week, but maybe a little bit less so than you would in the past. with all that together, let's take a look at the model's top 10 here and Bet the Number. So the Bet the Number experts have Rory McIlroy as the number 1 play. Aaron Rai with this form as number 2 is not a surprise, especially given that he's won this event before. And then you've got Xander at number 3. So I like this model. I like, it's simple, right? Like I said before, you don't want to bog yourself too much, but you've got 3 winners at the top that have won at this event before, right? So that's kind of what we want to see in the modeling, right? Are the guys that have won here before showing up at the top, and you've got that with those 3 players. A few other guys, McIntyre, who's played very well here. Davis Thompson coming in with his form and his win. Not a surprise with the second and first place finish that he's showing up here. But Minwoo has been very solid at this event in the past. Maybe a guy to keep an eye on. And I believe they don't have all the DP World Tour stuff in here, but he's been even better when this was a DP World Tour sanctioned event. You got Morikawa there at number 10. Mark Hubbard, maybe a surprise, but he's there at number 11 in their modeling. All guys to potentially keep an eye on this week. So hopefully it gives you a few stats to keep an eye on and gives you an idea of how I'm attacking this kind of slate. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the course breakdown this week. Hopefully you feel a little bit more prepared to go out there and get your exposure in and are ready to get after it for this event. I'm stoked. I'm super excited out there for the Open Championship next week, but this will be a good little appetizer out there before the full feast next week. But either way, appreciate your support here on the channel as per usual. Go ahead and smash that like button for me if you guys haven't already, and also go ahead and comment down below what you've got as the winning score for this week. If you go ahead and get that correct, you will win a free month of my Patreon, which speaking of, I think we had a winner last week out here for this very giveaway. So make sure to hit me up on Twitter out there if you were that winner, and I'll get you guys the free month. And of course, over there, I believe we had somebody take Davis Thompson too. So if you're a winner of one of those giveaways, as per usual, guys, just reach out to me on Twitter, on Patreon if you're already a member over there, and I'll comp your month for you. But yeah, that's all we've got for that. So go ahead, give me your winning score. Go ahead, enter a free chance to earn a month of that Patreon page, and let's go out there and have ourselves a week. We will have the DFS embedding preview dropping on a little bit later on this week, and of course our weekly live stream Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, touching on any of your last second questions, as well as ownership, weather forecast over the first few days, all the last second information that you'll need. So make sure to stop on by for that a little bit later on. Subscribe so you don't miss any of that video content when it drops, and let's have ourselves a week, guys.